What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a handful of early access titles that I think are worth keeping an eye on in 2024, a couple of which I've mentioned here and there, but going through a bunch of games recently, I realized that a lot of things I was looking forward to were, in fact, early access releases, so I thought it might be interesting to talk about that a little more specifically, as I otherwise tend to ignore them until they fully launch, at least in terms of much coverage. And the reason I do that is an exact disclaimer I want to give here at the beginning of this video. The reason I'm usually hesitant to cover them much ahead of their full launch is that because due to their very nature, they are subject to change. And while some games make pretty good use of early access, such as just recently Baldur's Gate 3 for instance, other times you'll see these projects languish in early access for years without ever making much progress if they release at all. So while I think a lot of these games are really interesting and I hope they wind up being good, this is not a recommendation on buying them or picking them up, rather just an attempt to put them on people's radar potentially. So in terms of a purchasing decision, that's not something I can help with until these games launch and I properly review them. Now, I did also want to mention here towards the beginning that I specifically went for games that I hadn't talked about as much, unless you watch my channel pretty regularly, mind you, and because of that, I left off some pretty big ones that you might be expecting, such as Hades 2 is getting an early access launch, Last Epoch is currently in early access but is set to release in a couple months. V Rising is in early access and I really enjoy it, but I'm again waiting for the full launch, and those are pretty well known, so I didn't feel the need to repeat them here outside of this, of course. So with that said, let's dive into the list. First up, we have Unforetold Witchstone, a project I've been following for a very long time actually, back before it was called Unforetold Witchstone. I think at one point it was just The Witchstones or something like that, which was a few years ago when they were securing funding, after which they went pretty radio silent for the last couple years, only re-emerging relatively recently, in the last 6 months or so, to announce that they have an early access planned for January 25th. But the reason I've been looking forward to this one is that it is an isometric CRPG with a big emphasis on player choice, turn-based combat, and all the usual things I enjoy. Now, what makes this game unique is its attempt to focus on a non-linear campaign or main quest, or lack thereof. This game is going to see you taking a party of adventurers running through certain areas which can present things like quests, of course, but how you choose to interact with the citizens of the world will mark certain milestones and affect your reputation within the landscape, which then gives rise to bigger opportunities that change and shape the rest of the area or the individual towns you might run across, etc. Combine that with a variety of approaches to gameplay like good old-fashioned stealth, talking your way into things, combat, and frankly this game is trying to do a lot of stuff, which is, of course, the reason for the early access launch. So it'll be worth keeping an eye on simply to see whether or not it manages to accomplish those goals, because if they can, I think it'll be great. But saying things is of course much easier than doing them. Either way though, once this launches into early access, I'll definitely be taking a look at it, so you can expect a video on this in a couple weeks. That brings us to our second entry, however, with Enshrouded. I got the chance to play Enshrouded via a demo during the last Next Fest, and while it's certainly, I would say, a bit earlier along in development than some of the other titles here, I still had a lot of fun with what I experienced, as this game is aiming to be a action-adventure mixed with survival crafting elements, so you can build up a base while also tracking down NPCs, taking on quests, and fighting back against the Shroud, a corrupted fog that has blanketed most of the kingdom, causing all sorts of problems. Naturally, you'd like to stop that and have to build, craft, and survive along the way. This one is launching on January 24th, just right before Witchstone, so another title we don't have much longer to wait on, though from what little I played, I enjoyed it a lot. Which brings us to number 3 on the list, with Tainted Grail, Fall of Avalon, a game that's already been in early access for a little while, right at the start of April in 2023, I believe, to be specific, so a little under a year. And when it launched in early access, I took an initial look at it and enjoyed it a good bit. Now, in many ways, from just looking at it, I'm sure you can see that it is relatively like Skyrim or something similar, but it is actually based on a board game known as Tainted Grail, which itself is a dark reimagining of Arthurian legends. What's already in the game is quite good, but is only the first chapter of a much larger title. They're working on other areas. The next one, I believe, is being added relatively soon, alongside other further improvements to the core game systems which are already in place. This will see things like player-owned houses, improvements to combat, things you might expect. Overall, though, I think Tainted Grail is a pretty cool title, and if over the course of early access they can clean up a little bit of the jank that was there and improve upon those core systems, which are already pretty good, I think they'll have a great game on their hands. Which brings us to number 4, probably the game on this list I've talked about the most here and there, which is Beast, an upcoming tactical RPG that is currently in early access. You take on the role of a prisoner returned home after a decade only to find it in ruins, and he would like to help fix that situation while at the same time battling his own inner beast, which turns out to be a very real demon, which leads to some interesting combat mechanics revolving around either saving or even killing your own party members to enable the beast. And it's a game that, while certainly rough around the edges in places, I think has a lot of potential and I think is worth keeping an eye on as a result. Though that does bring us to our final entry, which is Cybernight's Flashpoint from the Treese Brothers. Another game that is currently in early access, and it is a squad tactics heist RPG set in a cyberpunk world. Somewhat similar to XCOM in terms of gameplay, that is to say, the mission-based tactical combat alongside supplemental systems that include setting up and preparing for your heists in this case, and even some good old-fashioned base management. And while the core of it is already pretty engaging, I do think the game needs a little bit of help in terms of options that make it continue to feel like a heist RPG as opposed to just a straight-up tactical combat sim, which is, of course, what it's in early access for. So, a game with a lot of potential, but a lot of it just comes down to how much they manage to capture that feeling of setting up and actually executing on the heist part of this game. All in all, there's a handful of games that, while still definitely a work in progress, I think are pretty cool and worth keeping an eye on, although almost certainly going to be a fair ways off, let's say, from their actual full launch date, which is when you can expect a review out of me. Though in a couple cases I will have a video showcasing a little more about them in just a couple weeks. But that is going to do it for today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, especially if you're looking forward to future content on some of these games. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.